There's a version of you that you've never met. It lives in the corners of your mind, quietly influencing your choices, your relationships, your fears, and even your self-sabotage. It's the part of you that you've buried deep beneath politeness, ambition and control, the part you were taught to hide because it wasn't acceptable, lovable, or safe. Carl Jung called this hidden self the shadow, a psychological container for all the thoughts, emotions, and instincts we repress to survive in a civilized world. But ignoring this shadow doesn't make it disappear. It makes it stronger, more chaotic, more controlling. And if you've ever wondered why you keep repeating painful patterns or why you feel like a stranger to yourself, this might be the reason. Shadow work is not about fixing what's broken. It's about uncovering what's been forgotten. It's about facing the darkest parts of yourself, not to shame them, but to understand them. Because within your shadow lies not just your wounds, but your deepest power. In this video, we'll explore how your shadow was formed, how it operates without your awareness, and how true healing begins the moment you stop running from who you really are. This is not self-help fluff. This is philosophy, psychology, and raw truth. Imagine living with a version of yourself you never fully meet, one that lurks behind your thoughts, shaping your fears, your reactions, and your darkest impulses. Carl Jung called this hidden force the shadow, not because it is inherently evil, but because it exists in darkness, away from conscious light. The shadow contains everything we repress, deny, or reject about ourselves. It's not just our anger, jealousy, or greed. It's also our forgotten dreams, our suppressed talents, and the raw, untamed truths about who we are. We bury these traits because we're taught they're unacceptable by parents, teachers, religion, and society at large. The shadow isn't just what we fear in others. It's what we secretly fear lives within us. And the irony? The more we ignore it, the more control it gains over our lives, silently pulling the strings from the background. Jung argued that the shadow emerges from the tension between who we really are and who we believe we're supposed to be. From childhood, we receive messages about what's good and what's bad. Crying too much? Weak. Expressing anger? Dangerous. Being too curious? Disruptive. So we adapt. We mold ourselves to survive socially and emotionally. But the parts of us that don't fit into this mold don't disappear. They're pushed down, repressed, and stored away like unwanted boxes in a dark basement. Over time, this repression creates an inner split, a version of ourselves we present to the world, the persona, and another version we hide, deny, and often fear, the shadow. This inner conflict becomes the root of self-sabotage, emotional outbursts, and the strange sense that we're not fully in control of our own behavior. What makes the shadow so powerful is its invisibility. Unlike conscious thoughts, the shadow operates from the unconscious. That means it shows up when you least expect it, when you're triggered, defensive, or caught off guard. Ever found yourself overreacting and thinking, "Why did I say that?" That's often the shadow speaking. It leaks out in dreams, slips of the tongue, and the way we judge others. And it's not just about negative traits. Many of us also repress our brilliance, sensuality, ambition, and creativity. Because somewhere along the way, we were made to believe those things were dangerous, selfish, or too much. The shadow is not the villain, it's the exile. And every part of ourselves that's been cast into the dark eventually fights to be seen, even if it must do so destructively. Ignoring it isn't a solution, it's an invitation for chaos. Understanding the shadow isn't about self-condemnation, it's about radical self-awareness. Jung believed that we cannot become whole until we face what we've disowned. Shadow work, then, is the process of turning toward the parts of ourselves we've avoided for years, sometimes decades. It's a journey that requires honesty, courage, and deep inner reflection. But it's not about eliminating the shadow. It's about integrating it, making peace with it, letting it speak so it no longer has to scream. Once we start doing this work, we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves that were never truly bad, only misunderstood. And in doing so, we move one step closer to authenticity. Because the truth is, The more we run from our shadow, the more we run from who we really are. The formation of the shadow begins in childhood, not as a conscious decision, but as a survival mechanism. We are born as raw, unfiltered beings, full of instincts, impulses, and emotions. As we grow, we learn very quickly what parts of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. A child who is naturally assertive may be told they're aggressive. One who cries easily may be told to toughen up. Over time, these aspects of the self that don't gain approval are pushed away, buried, deep into the unconscious, but they don't disappear, they fester. They become part of what Jung called the shadow, the rejected self that lives just beneath the surface, influencing our actions, relationships, and identity in ways we don't realize. Ironically, the more we try to become good in the eyes of others, the more we disown authentic parts of ourselves. Society plays a massive role in shaping what we repress. Every culture has its norms, expectations, and unspoken rules. These cultural templates dictate what emotions are valued, which behaviors are rewarded, and which identities are safe to express. In many societies, vulnerability is seen as weakness, anger is feared, and individuality is discouraged in favor of conformity. So the child learns quickly, often through subtle cues and punishments, that to be accepted they must split off parts of who they are. The shadow is formed not only through trauma, but through subtle, everyday socialization. And because it's tied so deeply to belonging and survival, it becomes a prison of internalized shame. By the time we reach adulthood, we may have no idea what parts of us were left behind in the name of being good enough. Repression becomes a habit so ingrained that we don't question it. Most people are walking around with a carefully crafted identity, a mask polished over years of conditioning. But beneath that mask lives the shadow, silently storing every unexpressed desire, every silenced emotion, every abandoned truth. And the more we repress, the more the shadow grows in strength. Carl Jung believed that what we fail to bring into consciousness comes back as fate. In other words, we will unconsciously recreate situations that force us to confront the parts of ourselves we've denied. Toxic relationships, sudden bursts of rage, unexplained fears, all of these can be expressions of a shadow screaming to be acknowledged. We are not afraid of monsters in the dark. We are afraid of the parts of us that we've kept in the dark. Understanding how the shadow is formed is not just an intellectual exercise. It's a return to the moment we were told, don't be that. Healing begins when we look at those formative moments, not with judgment, but with compassion. When we realize that repression was our way of adapting, of surviving. It opens the door to forgiveness, not just for others, but for ourselves. Jung didn't see the shadow as evil, he saw it as necessary. To live fully, we must integrate, not eliminate, what's hidden. This means revisiting our story with new eyes, seeing not only what was done to us, but how we abandoned ourselves in response. The path of shadow work begins with this realization that the darkness inside us was once light we weren't allowed to keep. Darker impulses. It's one of the most vital psychological constructs in the philosophy of Carl Jung. At its core, the shadow represents everything within us that we've disowned, rejected, or buried. These aren't always evil or malevolent traits. More often, they are simply parts of the self that didn't fit the social mold we were told to conform to. The child who was punished for being too loud might repress their natural charisma. The teenager mocked for sensitivity might learn to bury their emotions. Over time, these rejected traits accumulate in the unconscious, like ghosts sealed in the basement of our psyche. We pretend they don't exist, but they're always there, silently shaping our behaviors, fears, desires, and even our identity. The shadow isn't just about what we hide from others, it's what we hide from ourselves. And because it's unconscious, we don't realize how much power it has over our daily lives. What makes the shadow so dangerous is precisely its invisibility. Since these repressed aspects of the self dwell in the unconscious, they operate in stealth mode. We often feel hijacked by moods or urges we can't explain. We lash out, sabotage ourselves, or act in ways we later regret, all without understanding why. That's your shadow at work. It's not trying to hurt you. In fact, it's trying to be seen. The shadow contains not just the so-called dark traits like rage, jealousy, or selfishness, but also positive aspects: power, creativity, sensuality, assertiveness, all exiled because they didn't fit the script. This repression is usually unconscious and begins early in life, shaped by family, culture, religion, and social expectations. The longer these parts go unacknowledged, the more distorted they become. And the more we deny them, the more they show up in our projections, our addictions, our relationships, and even our dreams. Carl Jung believed that the shadow is not inherently evil. In fact, he warned that the failure to confront our inner darkness is what makes it dangerous. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This quote captures the essence of shadow work. Unless we become aware of the parts of ourselves we've hidden, they will continue to govern us from behind the scenes. The shadow is like a splinter in your psyche. The more you ignore it, the more infected it becomes. And the tragedy is, many of us spend our entire lives trying to maintain the illusion of being good or normal, while secretly feeling hollow or fragmented. But here's the twist. The shadow is also the key to your wholeness. Inside those rejected parts is the raw material of your true self. To deny the shadow is to deny your full humanity. To integrate it is to begin the journey toward authenticity. Facing. The shadow isn't easy. It requires brutal honesty, emotional courage, and a willingness to encounter the parts of yourself you've been taught to fear or hate. But doing so is the first step toward inner liberation. Shadow work isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. That means embracing the complexity of your inner world rather than pretending to be one-dimensional. It's about admitting you can be both kind and cruel, generous and selfish, strong and vulnerable, sometimes all at once. The modern world often encourages a superficial sense of identity. Be positive, be productive, be palatable. But the shadow reminds us that there's more beneath the surface, and it demands that we look. Only when we dare to explore our psychological basement can we stop being victims of our unconscious patterns. The shadow is not the enemy. It's the part of you that's been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be acknowledged, understood, and finally welcomed home. The formation of the shadow begins at the very start of life. As children, we are born whole, curious, expressive, wild, emotional, imaginative, and full of potential. But we are also born into a world with rules. Very early on, we start receiving messages, subtle and overt, about what parts of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. Maybe your anger was met with disapproval, or your creativity was dismissed as foolishness. Perhaps your vulnerability was exploited, or your independence punished. In response, you learn to cut off those pieces of yourself, to fit in, to be loved, to survive. Each rejection, whether it came from parents, teachers, peers, or institutions, chipped away at your authentic self, and what was deemed unacceptable got stuffed into the unconscious. That's where the shadow begins to grow, not as something evil, but as a storage room for all the parts of you that had no place in the daylight of your early life. Carl Jung emphasized that the shadow is largely a social construct, shaped by what society rewards and punishes. Think about it. What is considered virtuous or shameful changes drastically across cultures and time periods. A quality like assertiveness might be praised in one context and condemned in another. The traits you learned to repress were not inherently bad. They just didn't align with the social norms you were born into. And so, we become actors wearing masks, playing roles that secure approval while burying what doesn't fit. Over time, this mask becomes our identity, and we forget that it's just a performance. Society rewards conformity, not wholeness. It prefers predictability to depth. The more we internalize these values, the more we police ourselves, until we become strangers to our own emotional complexity. The shadow, meanwhile, waits. It grows in silence, becoming more potent the more we pretend it isn't there. Repression is the main mechanism by which the shadow is formed. Unlike suppression, which is conscious, repression happens automatically and unconsciously. It's your psyche protecting you, shielding you from emotions and traits you weren't ready to deal with. As a child, This was often necessary. A sensitive. Boy who cries might be told to man up until he learns to swallow his sadness. A rebellious girl might be disciplined until she replaces her fire with silence. These are not isolated incidents. They form the architecture of your personality. And yet these repressed elements don't disappear. They sink beneath the surface, operating in secret. They influence your relationships, your self-esteem, your career choices, even your dreams. You may think you're making decisions freely, but in truth, the shadow is calling the shots. The parts you rejected didn't die. They simply learned to speak a different language, the language of sabotage, addiction, anxiety, and projection. 2. Truly understand yourself, you have to return to the origin story of your shadow. That means revisiting the wounds of childhood, not to blame, but to understand. What parts of you were not allowed to exist? What emotions did you learn to hide? Which desires were labeled wrong? These questions are not comfortable, but they're necessary. Jung said that every human being has a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We live in a culture obsessed with self-improvement, but allergic to self-confrontation. We want to be better without acknowledging the full spectrum of who we are. But true healing doesn't come from perfection. It comes from integration. The shadow is not something to be eliminated. It's a source of immense power and insight. But before you can reclaim it, you must first understand how it was created, piece by piece, repression by repression, in the name of love, survival, and belonging. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the mask you wear to face the world, the version of yourself that conforms, pleases, adapts, and survives. It is the social costume you crafted over years to gain acceptance, avoid rejection, and fulfill expectations. You wear it at work, with family, in relationships. Even when you're alone, you might still be performing. The persona is not inherently false, it's necessary. Without it, you couldn't function in society. But problems begin when you confuse the mask for your true self. Over-identification with the persona leads to alienation, not just from others, but from yourself. You begin to live out a script, a role, while your deeper, authentic essence is locked away. And what you repress doesn't vanish. It becomes what Jung called the shadow monster, the accumulation of your denied truths, unexpressed emotions, and repressed instincts. You may look polished on the outside, but inside, the disowned. Parts of you begin to roar. The more polished your mask becomes, the more grotesque the monster behind it can grow. Why? Because the persona is like a well-lit stage, and the shadow is everything left in the dark backstage. The more you perfect your role, be it the achiever, the caretaker, the intellectual, the good person, the more pressure you feel to hide anything that contradicts that role. Anger, lust, jealousy, fear, even joy or spontaneity, anything that threatens the illusion must be buried. Over time, your inner world becomes fragmented. You sense something isn't right, but you can't. Name it. You may feel empty, lost, or disconnected despite outward success. That's the monster stirring. It whispers in moments of weakness, erupts in arguments, sabotages relationships, or appears in your dreams. You begin to fear what's inside you, but the real danger is not the shadow itself. The real danger is your refusal to meet it. The conflict between the persona and the shadow creates an inner war. On the outside, you smile, nod, achieve. Inside, something clenches, resents, or rebels. This split creates anxiety, depression, burnout, and often a crisis of identity. You may wake up one day wondering, who am I really? That question is terrifying because it threatens to unravel everything you've built. But Jung taught that wholeness comes not from clinging to the mask, but from embracing what lies beneath it. To meet the monster isn't to become evil or destructive. It is to realize that you are not just light. You are light and darkness, strength and vulnerability, chaos and order. The monster is only terrifying because it's been ignored. When you turn toward it, when you ask what it wants, when you integrate its lessons, you become powerful in a new way. Not performative power, but rooted, conscious, embodied power. The process of meeting the shadow is not glamorous. It's humbling. You might uncover envy you never admitted, rage you thought you'd outgrown, or desires you were told to be ashamed of. But this confrontation is not your downfall, it's your liberation. The persona can only take you so far. It's useful, but it is not your soul. True freedom begins when you allow yourself to remove the mask, to look the monster in the eyes, and see not a beast, but a wounded part of you asking to be loved, accepted, and understood. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the heart of shadow work. The path to authenticity is paved with courage, the courage to drop the act and face who you really are. Not the version of you that pleases others, but the whole truth of your being. That's where the healing begins. Most people imagine the shadow as something obvious, like explosive anger or malicious behavior. But the truth is far more subtle and dangerous. When you haven't integrated your shadow, it doesn't sit quietly in the basement of your psyche. It leaks into everything. It distorts your choices, colors your relationships, and shapes your perception of reality. And the scariest part, you often don't even notice. One of the most common signs that your shadow is in control is overreaction. When someone says or does something that triggers a disproportionate emotional response in you, rage, jealousy, fear, it's usually not about them. It's your shadow lashing out, trying to be seen. For instance, if you feel extreme irritation toward someone who's confident or assertive, it might be because you've repressed your own need to be heard, to take up space. Your shadow isn't just what you hate in others, it's what you've denied in yourself. Another powerful sign is projection. You find yourself judging others harshly for qualities you secretly possess but refuse to acknowledge. You call someone manipulative, but you've ignored your own passive-aggressive behavior. You label someone arrogant, but you're afraid to own your ambition. Projection is the shadow's favorite disguise. It lets you see your disowned traits, but only in other people. It allows you to avoid responsibility while still expressing the part of you that longs for integration. It's the psychological equivalent of yelling at a mirror for showing your reflection. This is why conflict in relationships can be such a goldmine for shadow work. The people who irritate or challenge you the most are often messengers from your own unconscious, carrying back pieces of your soul you've abandoned. You think you're avoiding them, but really you're running from yourself. Self-sabotage is another telltale sign. You keep missing deadlines, ruining opportunities, or pushing away love and intimacy, then wonder why nothing changes. It's not because you're lazy or incapable. It's because your shadow is steering the ship from behind the scenes. Deep down, it might believe you don't deserve success, or that love is dangerous, or that being seen is unsafe. These beliefs were formed long ago, often in childhood, and buried for protection. But now they operate silently, hijacking your progress. You think you're choosing freely, but you're really obeying old unconscious scripts. And because the shadow thrives in darkness, you'll rationalize your sabotage. I didn't really want that job. They weren't the right person anyway. But underneath the excuses is fear. Fear of being exposed, rejected, or forced to confront who you truly are. Shadow control doesn't shout, it whispers, and it's convincing. Perhaps the most dangerous sign of shadow domination is emotional numbness. You're not angry or sad, you're just blank. You go through the motions, check the boxes, do what's expected. On the outside, you're functioning, but inside you feel nothing. That's not peace, it's suppression. The shadow has become so buried that even your light has been dimmed. You've shut down the pain, but also the joy. You don't risk, don't speak up, don't cry, don't laugh too loud. You stay safe, invisible, disconnected. That's the price of a life, ruled by the unconscious. But numbness is not the end, it's a signal. It means your inner world is waiting. The pain you avoid is the path to the power you've lost. When you begin to notice these signs, not with shame but with curiosity, you take the first step toward freedom. The shadow only controls you when you refuse to see it. Once you look, it starts to lose its grip. Projection is one of the most deceptive and common psychological defenses we use, and almost always unconsciously. Carl Jung famously said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's the core of projection. It's when the parts of ourselves we deny, our fears, insecurities, desires, or rage, are too painful or unacceptable to admit, so we see them in other people instead. When you condemn someone for being selfish, it might be because you've repressed your own healthy self-interest for years. If you're overly bothered by someone's arrogance, perhaps it's because you've disowned your own need to be seen, heard, and recognized. Projection acts like a smokescreen. It keeps you focused outward, blind to what's happening within. It feels safer that way. But in avoiding the discomfort of self-confrontation, you distort reality and damage your relationships. The deeper danger of projection is that it prevents real intimacy. When you interact with others through the lens of your projections, you're not seeing them, you're seeing your wounds. This distorts friendships, romantic connections, even how you view authority figures. For instance, someone with a repressed inner critic may perceive their partner's neutral feedback as constant judgment, or someone who has suppressed their own anger might constantly attract or accuse others of being aggressive. This isn't coincidence. It's the unconscious looking for a stage, and tragically, the more intense the projection, the more blind we become to it. We convince ourselves that our interpretations are facts, that they really are the problem. We externalize blame instead of turning inward. This is why projection is such a central concept in Jungian psychology, because it reveals how the ego protects itself by turning inner darkness into external enemies. One of the clearest ways to identify your projections is to track what consistently triggers you in others. Not just the occasional annoyance, but the people who live rent-free in your head. The ones you judge harshly, obsess over, or feel a strange sense of moral superiority toward. Often, they reflect aspects of yourself you've buried. The ambitious person you criticize might represent your own repressed drive. The emotional person you mock could mirror the vulnerability you're afraid to feel. Projection is the shadow's megaphone. It allows your disowned traits to scream through the mouths of others. And the irony is, we attract what we reject. Life will keep placing people in front of you who activate your shadow until you finally recognize what they're reflecting. This isn't to excuse bad behavior in others, but to emphasize that your reactions to them always say something about you, too. Doing shadow work means calling back your projections. It means asking, what does this reaction say about me? Instead of immediately blaming the outside world. And it's not easy, because facing your projections requires radical honesty. You'll have to admit that some of the things you hate in others are present in you, not necessarily in the same form or intensity, but the root is there. Maybe you've never screamed at someone, but you've fantasized about control. Maybe you're not cruel, but you've shut down emotionally in ways that hurt others. The point isn't to shame yourself, it's to become whole. Jung said we don't become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. That means re-owning what we've disowned, integrating what we've pushed away. Only then can we see others clearly, not as mirrors of our wounds, but as humans in their own right. That's the beginning of true freedom. Knowing yourself sounds noble, something everyone claims to want. But in reality, self-knowledge is terrifying. Why? Because beneath your curated identity lies a storm of contradictions, unmet needs, shameful impulses, forgotten pain, and unresolved memories. It's one thing to post about self-awareness. It's another to actually meet the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Carl Jung understood that the human psyche is layered like an ocean. The surface is where your persona floats, the version of you that pleases, performs, and pretends. But beneath that is the unconscious, a vast abyss filled with truths you've buried so deep you forgot they were even yours. Most people don't fear monsters in the dark. They fear their own reflection once the lights are turned on, because truly knowing yourself means dismantling the lies you've told to survive. And for the ego, that can feel like death. The fear of knowing yourself is rooted in the terror of disintegration. Your ego, your sense of I am this, is built on selective memory and adaptation. From childhood, you learned which parts of you were acceptable and which ones had to go underground. Over time, you built a personality that could win approval, avoid rejection, and navigate society. But that personality isn't the full truth. It's a mask. When you begin to dig deeper, you risk unraveling the very structure that's kept you emotionally safe. You might discover you're not as kind as you thought, or that your motivations aren't as pure. You might uncover envy, rage, pride, neediness, emotions that contradict your self-image. That's the terror, the realization that the person you've presented to the world is incomplete, and that becoming whole means welcoming back everything you've exiled. That process feels like falling apart, but it's actually falling into truth. There's a reason ancient myths and spiritual traditions often depict inner transformation as a descent into the underworld. In Jungian terms, this descent is symbolic of confronting your shadow, the rejected, disowned parts of the self. It's the psychological version of dying and being reborn, and it's not poetic fluff, it's real psychological labor. Most people avoid this descent by staying busy, staying numb, or staying in denial. They fear what they might find if they ever sit in silence long enough to listen. And make no mistake, the unconscious will speak if you give it space, but when it does, it won't whisper sweet affirmations. It will confront you with the parts of your past and personality that you've refused to integrate. This confrontation doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're becoming conscious, and consciousness isn't comfort. It's clarity. That's what most people run from, the clarity of who they really are. But here's the paradox. While knowing yourself feels like a threat to the ego, it's the only path to inner peace. What you don't face controls you. What you deny festers. What you repress leaks out sideways through anxiety, projection, self-sabotage, or even illness. The journey inward is scary because it strips away illusion, but illusion is what keeps you fragmented, reactive, and afraid. When you finally summon the courage to face your depths, you begin to realize something profound. The darkness you feared wasn't your enemy. It was your wounded innocence, your unmet needs, your buried truth. You feared your depth because no one taught you how to hold it with compassion. Shadow work teaches you that integration is not about perfection, it's about honesty. The more you know yourself, the less control your fears have over you. And that is the beginning of true power, not over others but over your own life. Once you face the terrifying depths within, the next step isn't to destroy what you find, it's to integrate it. And this is where the true magic of shadow work begins. Integration is the process of accepting and uniting the rejected parts of yourself. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That means real healing isn't about positive thinking or pretending the darkness doesn't exist. It's about meeting the darkness, listening to it, and letting it teach you what it came to reveal. The emotions you've repressed, anger, jealousy, grief, rage, don't disappear. They just wait underground until they have a chance to be acknowledged. Shadow work gives them that chance, allowing you to reclaim the parts of yourself you've abandoned. This is not weakness. This is psychological alchemy. Healing through integration doesn't look like peace at first. In fact, it often looks like chaos. That's because the psyche is reorganizing itself, letting go of outdated defenses and making room for new, more honest ways of being. You may cry for no reason. You may feel rage at things you thought you'd moved past. You may feel like you don't know who you are anymore. But all of that is part of the process. Think of shadow work like emotional composting. Everything rotten and buried is brought to the surface, broken down, and transformed into fertile ground for growth. You begin to see that the traits you hated in others were often your own projections. You start noticing how your patterns of blame and shame have kept you from taking responsibility for your life. As integration deepens, you stop seeking enemies outside yourself because you've confronted the one within and you've chosen to embrace it rather than fight it. This inner shift produces subtle but powerful outer changes. You start to respond instead of react. You begin to speak truth instead of performing for approval. You stop apologizing for your existence. That's the power of integration. It gives you access to your full emotional range without being enslaved by it. You no longer need to pretend to be only light. You are light and shadow, clarity and confusion, grace and grit. When you stop exiling your inner contradictions, you gain a new kind of stability, one that doesn't require external validation to feel whole. That's what Jung meant when he talked about individuation. It's the process of becoming your truest self, not the self shaped by fear or societal expectations, but the one forged by the courageous act of seeing yourself fully. Integration makes you honest, and honesty makes you powerful. Not in a dominating way, but in the kind of power that radiates authenticity. And here's where transformation becomes liberation. When you embrace your shadow, it no longer sabotages you. When you stop fearing your inner depths, you become free to explore life from a place of curiosity rather than defensiveness. This is the essence of healing through integration, reclaiming your lost energy, your suppressed creativity, your unspoken truths. You stop living in reaction to your past and start living in alignment with your whole self. You find that many of your problems were actually symptoms of disconnection from your truth, your needs, your power. Shadow work doesn't fix you because you were never broken. It reunites you with the parts you were told to hide, giving you back your full humanity. In a world obsessed with image, shadow work is a quiet revolution. It's not loud. It's not glamorous, but it is real. And once you taste the freedom of living integrated, there is no going back. Shadow work isn't something that only happens in a therapist's office or during deep meditation. In fact, some of the most powerful moments of shadow work happen in the middle of your everyday life. When you're running late and snap at a loved one, when you feel a wave of jealousy seeing someone else's success, when an old memory flashes back and leaves your stomach in knots. These are not random emotional events, they're invitations. Every trigger is a teacher. Every overreaction is a doorway. The shadow doesn't knock politely, it jolts you. And most of the time we miss the message because we're too busy trying to suppress the emotion or blame someone else. But once you start seeing your reactions as road signs pointing to what's unhealed, the mundane becomes meaningful. The commute, the arguments, the uncomfortable silences, they all become arenas where your unconscious reveals itself. Shadow work becomes less about rituals and more about awareness. One way to begin this work in daily life is to notice your judgments. Who do you criticize the most? What qualities in others make your skin crawl? The answer might surprise you because often the traits you despise are ones you've disowned in yourself. If you're constantly annoyed by people who are too needy, it may be because your own vulnerability was once rejected or punished. If arrogance enrages you, perhaps there's a part of you that was never allowed to feel pride. Your shadow hides in your reactions. The trick is not to moralize these feelings, but to get curious about them. Why does that person get under your skin? Why did that seemingly small thing ruin your day? Shadow work is not about blaming yourself. It's about reclaiming the parts you've left behind. And that starts with everyday awareness. You don't need to wait for a breakdown to begin. You just need to pay attention. The most accessible form of daily shadow work is journaling with brutal honesty. Not polished affirmations or gratitude lists, but raw, unfiltered truth. Write down your jealous thoughts. Admit your hidden resentments. Let your shame speak without censorship. This isn't about being negative. It's about being real. Your shadow doesn't need more judgment. It needs your presence. And as you begin to record these emotional patterns, something powerful happens. The story beneath the reaction begins to unfold. You start to notice that your anger isn't just about the present moment. It's connected to being dismissed as a child. Your insecurity isn't just about this job interview. It's linked to a lifetime of feeling invisible. These connections don't erase the pain, but they illuminate the source. And once you see where something comes from, you stop being blindly controlled by it. You can choose. That's where the freedom starts. Finally, bring shadow work into your interactions. Practice pausing before you react. Ask yourself, what am I really feeling right now? The answer might not come immediately, but even asking the question breaks the spell of reactivity. Shadow work is not about fixing your personality. It's about bringing your unconscious into the light so you can live with intention rather than compulsion. It's about catching yourself in moments of deflection, projection, and defensiveness, and choosing honesty instead. It's about replacing blame with responsibility and denial with self-awareness. Over time, your relationships shift, not because others change, but because you're no longer playing out the same unconscious scripts. You stop needing control. You stop needing perfection. You start living more fully in the messiness of real integrated life, and that's the real magic. Shadow work doesn't just change your inner world, it transforms how you move through the outer one. If shadow work leads to personal power, authenticity and freedom, why isn't it encouraged? Why don't we learn it in school or see it modeled in our leaders? The answer is simple and disturbing, because a society built on conformity and consumerism does not benefit from individuals who are deeply self-aware. Shadow work is disruptive. It breaks illusions. It asks questions that threaten systems. A person who's done shadow work doesn't buy things to fill emotional voids. They don't blindly follow rules or play roles that no longer fit. They're not as easy to manipulate with fear, shame, or guilt. In other words, they're not ideal consumers or obedient citizens. And so, we're taught the opposite. We're taught to numb, to stay busy, to keep scrolling, to chase validation instead of depth. The modern world is perfectly designed to keep you distracted from yourself, because if you really saw what was inside you, you might stop playing the game. Entertainment, advertising, even wellness culture, these aren't neutral forces. They shape how we see ourselves and where we focus our energy. Social media, for example, thrives on persona. We curate images of our lives, our bodies, our beliefs. We're rewarded for presenting an ideal, not for integrating our inner darkness. Think about it. Who goes viral for admitting their shame or exploring their rage? Vulnerability doesn't trend, and when it does, it's often sanitized into inspirational soundbites. But shadow work isn't pretty. It's not brand-friendly. It won't make you popular. It's messy, slow, and deeply personal, and that makes it a threat. Because a person who embraces their shadow can't be controlled by public opinion. They no longer need approval to exist. That kind of freedom is dangerous to a culture that depends on insecurity to sell solutions. Society hates shadow work, not because it's wrong, but because it's powerful. Even institutions that claim to guide us, religion, education, politics, often function to suppress shadow integration. Morality becomes about obedience, not exploration. Schools reward compliance, not curiosity. Religion, in many cases, turns shadow aspects into sins to be feared rather than parts to be understood. We're told to be good, be nice, be productive, but not to be whole. Wholeness is inconvenient. It questions authority. It refuses easy answers. And it makes people harder to predict, harder to control. But here's the paradox. The more you avoid your shadow, the more controlled you actually are. Your unexamined trauma, your repressed rage, your denied desires, they run your life from the dark. They influence who you trust, who you fear, who you love. Shadow work doesn't make you rebellious, it makes you sovereign. And sovereign people don't fit neatly into systems that rely on obedience over authenticity. So how do we begin resisting this cultural suppression of self? By slowing down. By asking questions that disrupt the narrative. Why do I feel this way? Who benefits from my self-doubt? What part of me have I been told to hide? Shadow work becomes a quiet rebellion. Every time you choose introspection over distraction, truth over convenience, authenticity over approval, you step out of the matrix. You stop being a puppet pulled by invisible strings and start becoming the author of your story. It's not glamorous, it won't always feel good, but it will set you free. And as more people do this work, the culture itself begins to shift. Systems built on fear start to crumble when individuals stop fearing themselves. This is why shadow work matters not just personally, but collectively. A society that encourages inner work is one that values real freedom. And the only way to get there is to begin with ourselves. Wholeness is not perfection. It's not becoming some enlightened, flawless version of yourself who never gets triggered or makes mistakes. Wholeness is embracing every fractured part of you The sacred and the shameful, the generous and the jealous, the courageous and the terrified. It's the integration of your inner contradictions. And ironically, the closer you get to this state, the less you need to prove anything to anyone. When you embrace who you really are, including the parts you've rejected, you no longer live in fear of being found out. There's nothing to hide, nothing to defend. That kind of internal peace cannot be faked, and it cannot be bought. It's earned through courage, the courage to face yourself fully without looking away. It's a deep exhale that comes from knowing you're no longer at war with yourself. And when you live in that kind of alignment, everything changes. Your choices, your relationships, your energy. You become congruent. The journey to becoming whole isn't linear. It's a spiral. You'll revisit old wounds you thought you'd healed. You'll uncover new layers of your shadow just when you thought you had it all figured out. But this is not regression, it's deepening. Wholeness isn't a finish line you cross, it's a way of being. And the more honest you are with yourself, the more aware you become of the subtle ways you've abandoned your truth to fit in, to feel loved, to avoid rejection. Shadow. Work teaches you to gently call yourself back, to reclaim the parts you exiled in order to survive. And with each piece you reintegrate, you gain strength, not the brittle kind built on image, but the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from radical self-acceptance, the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, it just is. And people feel, they may not know why, but they sense your wholeness, and it gives them permission to begin seeking their own. What happens when you become whole? You stop seeking completion in others. You stop trying to be someone else's idea of lovable. You begin to create from authenticity rather than approval. You walk into rooms without performing. You leave situations that dishonor your truth, not out of anger, but because you've finally remembered your worth. And you begin to love, not from need or fear, but from wholeness. That kind of love isn't possession or projection, it's presence. It's witnessing someone without trying to fix or change them. It's showing up as your full self and allowing others to do the same. That is the ripple effect of embracing who you really are. Your healing becomes a mirror. Your presence becomes medicine. You no longer perpetuate cycles of fear, control, or shame because you've broken them within yourself. That's the revolution. It doesn't start with activism or ideologies. It starts in the mirror. Carl Jung wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." And that one sentence carries the essence of shadow work. Being good is often just being obedient to external expectations. It's about fitting into the mold, playing the role, following the rules, regardless of whether they align with your soul. But wholeness is radical. It's reclaiming your humanity in full color, full range. It's knowing that your darkness doesn't make you unlovable. It makes you real. You stop chasing the illusion of purity and start embodying your depth. And in doing so, you finally meet the person you were always meant to be. Not the version shaped by fear, trauma, or societal pressure, but the raw, radiant, unapologetic you. That's what shadow work offers. Not a better mask, but no mask. At all, just truth, just presence, just the quiet power of a person who is no longer afraid of who they really are. What if the thing you've been running from your entire life is the very thing that holds the key to your freedom? We spend years, sometimes decades, polishing the surface, trying to be good, trying to be liked, trying to be successful, spiritual, stable. But beneath the surface is a voice we keep silencing, a voice that whispers truths we're not ready to hear. Not because they're evil, but because they're inconvenient. They break the illusion, they threaten the image, and so we push them down. We bury our anger, our envy, our lust, our grief, our longing. We perform instead of connect. We project instead of reflect. We suffer quietly, sometimes successfully, but the shadow does not die in the dark. It waits. It waits for us to stop pretending. It waits for the moment we are brave enough to sit in silence and say, "I want to know who I really am, even the parts I've been taught to fear." This is not easy work, but it is sacred. To do shadow work is not to become someone else. It is to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. It is to re-meet yourself with eyes unclouded by shame, by judgment, by denial. And in that meeting, something powerful happens. You begin to see that your wounds were not weaknesses. They were invitations, invitations to integrate, to evolve, to become whole. And from that wholeness, you begin to live differently. Not because someone told you to, but because when you finally accept who you are, you no longer live in fear of the truth. You become the truth. So if you feel lost, if you're exhausted from pretending, if you're haunted by a sense that something in you has been exiled, go there, go into the shadow. Not to conquer it, but to understand it, not to erase it, but to embrace it. Because the truth is, the parts of you that you've been taught to fear are often the most beautiful, most raw, most alive. Shadow work isn't a path for the faint of heart, but for those who walk it, it's the beginning of liberation. Not the kind of freedom that comes from escaping who you are, but the kind that comes from finally returning home to yourself.